Hi, everybody. I'm Gary McGraw. I'm the co-founder of the Berryville Institute of Machine Learning, but I'm really best known for my work in software security, where sadly people have taken to calling me the grandfather of the field. Makes me feel old. I'm here with two super important people to talk about the future, to talk about machine learning, artificial intelligence, and what happens when enterprises adopt this technology more rapidly than you even know what they're doing. So my two panelists here are Jim Routh and Neil. Jim, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm a former CISO six times across financial services and healthcare. I served as a board member of the FS ISAC and the Health ISAC for many, many years. I'm now doing board work, advisory work. Uh, I teach cybersecurity at NYU, and I am the chief trust officer for a company called Savient. So I'm kind of in the mode of where I work with people I like, present company included in that. I do the kind of
Sure.
work that I like to do, and Gen AI governance is high on the list, and I only work when I want. So I got a pretty good balance.
Super. So Neil has an impossible to pronounce last name. I didn't even want to try. Um,
Serebryany, it's easy.
Serebryany. Is it really that easy? It has more letters than that. So Neil's running a incredibly important company in this space, and I would like him to tell us a little about that.
Yeah, thanks so much, both. Jim, you kind of have a dream job there, I have to say. Neil Serebryany, I'm the founder and CEO of Calypso AI. We're leaders in the field of AI security and enablement, and we're building for this world of many, many machine learning models, many AI agents, the workforce and the kind of nature of work changing over the next couple of years, and all of these questions around how do we enable the enterprise to transform in a secure manner?
Super. So today we're going to take an in-depth view of AI and security and cover kind of six critical aspects of what I'd like to call saying yes to AI while still properly managing enterprise risk. We're going to cover managing new and evolving risks, identifying where in your organization those risks apply, talking about controls that enable adoption of AI, discussing governance and consistency, and then really most importantly, talking about real collaboration through leadership instead of saying no. And then at our deep peril and hazard, trying to predict the future. So this is going to be a blast. We'll start out talking about kind of what happens when security intersects something like AI or AI swamps something like security, as the case may be. So, first of all, what does generative machine learning do anyway? Neil, you want to tell us
Um,
that?
yeah, of course. I'm very, very happy to do that. So, effectively, what is transformer architecture model, which is the underlying model that's kind of responsible, or type of architecture of a model that's responsible for our kind of current wave of generative AI? Really, it's a auto encoding and auto decoding word prediction system, meaning that effectively we're taking enormous, voluminous amount of data representing probably about 80% of all of the known data in the world. We're feeding it into models. We're training these models at a very, very high cost, in excess of $100 million at this point, for a single training run. And then we are gaining the ability to have eerily accurate word prediction machines.
Excellent. I love that's very tight and so right. But the last part I think was critical. Um, Word prediction machines. So here's a question. I mean, when you play with these things, it's just kind of astounding and it also is eerie. But should, say, auto-associated predictive generation be used to do anything or enhance anything? What do you think? I mean, why don't we throw that one over to Jim?
Yeah, so the the challenge is for when you use Gen AI and you look at the output, and you're like, wow, that's really insightful. Like I like that they poured through massive amounts of data to come up with that answer. There's probably a lot of critical thinking and logic and reasoning that goes into that, and good judgment. And it's none of those things. There's none of that. It's word prediction using tokenization, just like Neil said. And so sometimes you get output that's unpredictable. Now, sometimes you get output that's inaccurate. It's what the data says, but it's inaccurate. And so when you feed that into business processes that depend on facts and accuracy, you have the recipe for significant problems. And that's in fact the challenge, because as we get exposed to Gen AI in our daily lives, we see practical applications and we see some things that aren't practical, and we're learning through that journey. Well, every enterprise has to go through that learning process as well. And, innovation and disruptive technology means we fail, we pivot, we learn, and we
Boom!
adjust.
Smack you right in the face. Right. So, so what you're saying is it can be used to do a lot, but probably not everything. And Neil, I want to make the counterpoint, which is super important. Should it be used to do anything? I mean, I think the answer
Yes.
would be yes.
Yes. Let me make the case for going long
Good.
on generative AI for a second,
Yes.
because we do not want to sound doomsday-ish at all. In fact, we're all massive believers in the technology. So
Yes.
here is the
I'm raising my
societal
hand
case.
for that. Yes.
Good. Okay, I'm glad to hear that. So here's the societal case. Okay, ever since the Malthusian period and the Industrial Revolution, technology progress and technology growth rates have been the primary drivers of increasing living standards, increasing wealth, and increasing GDP in our society. And we've had this problem in the developed world, and I'm going to use US statistics as my way of arguing this point. In the US, if you take the years 2002 and go all the way up to 2019, I haven't been able to find more recent data because of the COVID skew, but there hasn't been any increase at all in labor productivity, meaning that any increase in GDP that you saw was a non-real increase to a large degree on a long enough time determinant basis. And for the first time in a really long time, all the way back to 2002, and before that, in terms of productivity increase rates, we have the ability to increase labor productivity. We have the ability to increase our GDP on a real basis as we think about AI agents, as we think about all of the things that generative AI can do for us. And that's the kind of bullish case for AI ultimately. It's making our societies wealthier and it's creating real GDP growth.
Excellent. So I think we all agree that we need to use this stuff for many reasons. And those are some good societal reasons. But we also agree that as we adopt this technology or we get swamped by it, as the case may be, we need to consider the risks related to doing that. And that we'll do a much better job and a much more effective job if we identify the risks ahead of time while we are adopting this technology. I think that there are risks in kind of big categories. There's some societal risks, there's some enterprise risks, there's some line of business risks, and there's some specific application risks. And I think one of the challenges of an executive level view of this stuff is that people mix those all together. And at RSA, they often start talking about particular specific application risks or things like prompt injection attacks right off the bat, which have very little to do with making decisions as a CISO or an executive or a person who's thinking about societal change and GDP. And we have to do all of those things. So, Jim, I just covered some societal, enterprise, LOB, specific application. Maybe you can give us one example of each, or maybe you and Neil can split that up somehow. Let's start with societal.
Yeah, from a societal perspective, we have a situation where that productivity gain that Neil talked about, which can be really significant in terms of upside, may disrupt the labor force in that people become disillusioned because they're like, Gen AI is taking my job. I can't do my job anymore. And in order to find new work, I have to learn Gen AI. So I'm kind of in this quandary. And And that's a societal challenge. We have other challenges. A very
One second.
practical. Yeah.
Does that remind you of what happened when software showed up in banking,
Yes.
say?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, so we did
Yes.
it before. I mean, banks became software houses and nobody died.
Yes.
We only
That's
had
true.
one sort of economic meltdown globally, but
It's
it
also
worked.
true. It did largely work. That is absolutely true. And it very well may work this time, but there's going to be upheaval
All right, so
associated.
that's one. I'm going to give you one more too. So line of business. What's the difference between, say, a line of business view of this versus somebody at the C table?
Well, a line of business view typically don't look at societal impact. They look at P&L impact, and
Oh,
rightly
yes.
so.
Yes.
So in that case, we have to think about how can we get better information into business processes to be more efficient and effective. And there's lots of ways of doing that. What we have to do is counteract or counterbalance the potential disruption that comes from bias information influencing critical decisions that ultimately have a negative impact on the market and potentially a negative impact on P&L.
Mhm.
The one thing, my first recommendation for CISOs or anybody in enterprise cyber governance is don't set policy that says we will never use Gen AI.
Oh, right.
and
Yeah.
and
Right.
some of my colleagues have taken that step early on because when we first got exposed a year ago, we were thinking about public, models and how they, permeate the enterprise. And frankly, that's one small aspect of how Gen AI is fundamentally changing the way we work. There's SaaS applications that are using Gen AI models today. There are we can build Gen AI models with thousands and thousands of LLMs that are available to us just through the software supply chain, and that's really the way that it's evolving. So the attack surface is fundamentally different than what we anticipated a year ago, and as a
Right.
result, the whole notion of being able to stop this in an enterprise
Stop
is
it. I mean,
foolhardy.
did we stop
It's
software? Nah, we didn't stop software. But did we have to secure it? Yeah, we're still trying to figure out how to do that. But we're in the same situation where this is going to happen. And not only that, we should be excited about it. And if we do the right
Okay,
thing, we can enhance the world, and also say
folks.
yes and get things done at the same time in a secure way. So one of the things we really need to focus on now is what are those new risks and how do we manage them properly? One of the things I've been working on in my work since retiring, and I retire about as well as Jim does, is thinking about enterprise level risk and thinking about application risk and thinking about sometimes societal risk from a security person's perspective. We identified 10 risks at BIML having to do with large language models, things like ChatGPT. And I'm going to just tell you about them very, very briefly. Recursive pollution, data debt, improper use, black box opacity, prompt manipulation, poison in the data, reproducibility economics, who owns the data, model trustworthiness, and so on. These are the sorts of things that we talk about. Of those things, many are things that we can recognize and control ahead of time as we adopt AI. And one of the things I want to do to kind of set the stage for thinking about adoption is to underline the importance of when to choose to do machine learning, when to use it and when not to use it. And I think that a thing that's made it easier for me is to understand what it does and how it does it. So here's the deal. If you have a computer and you know how to do something like a business process, you can write a program to do that. We'll call that a how machine. But in order to create a how machine, you have to know how. Sometimes with a new line of business or something new, we don't know how, but we have a big pile of what. And so machine learning takes a what pile and tries to build a what machine when we don't know how, which calls into question something that's important. We are using this technology when we don't know how, and that's okay because we're building a what machine. The real question then is, what's the what? What's in the what? Where did the what come from? Do I really want a what machine that does that? And I think thinking about it that way really helps. So from a new technology impacting enterprise risk security, we have to think about it that way. When I'm not really sure how the thing does what it does in the end because it's a what machine, should I still use it? And the answer, I believe, is yes, because we are pushing the limits of what we can do with this tech on purpose. We just can't get out over our skis. So, Neil, when you are adopting a new technology to build these what machines, how do you make sure that you don't get over your skis?
Fantastic question, Gary. Let's talk about the types of risk you can have as an enterprise, the types of risks you're likely to have, and how you mitigate those risks. So, three possible states of acting as an enterprise. One, you're building your own foundation model or what machine, to use Gary's parlance. That's pretty unlikely. It costs $100 million plus to build your own what machine. I'm going to adopt that from now on, Gary. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And they're open source models that you can already leverage freely instead of building your own what machine. So if you are the typical enterprise CISO, you probably are not thinking about that at the moment. You then have the ability to fine tune a model. That is something that are kind of slightly bigger CISOs may be thinking about and maybe confronting inside of their enterprise. Let's call that a 20% of possible organizations use case. And then you have the using generative AI side of the house. That's probably every single enterprise, every single organization that is listening to this session with us. And
Right.
as you are using generative AI models, as you have them in use or you have inference with each of these models, you have significant risks around who has access to what model, who has access to what AI agent you've been able to build. You need to have policy-based access controls. You have significant amounts of risk around what data am I sending to what model? What data is being sent back from what model? And how do I have the ability to control on a per user, per application, per model basis, my kind of data governance at inference? And then you have all of the risks associated with how do I understand everything that's happening across the board? How do I observe the risks that are happening? How can I understand all of the prompts, all of the responses that are flowing through all of my users, all of my applications that have embedded models, and all of the agents that you're building?
Well, that
And
sounds
I
like
think
that sounds like just a small problem, Neil, but it does but it does remind
tiny.
me just does remind me just a little bit of what happened when software swamped us. I mean, we could have taken everything you said, and if we got rid of the part about LLMs and we just said software instead of every time you used a technical term, I mean, honestly, some of us old guys with the white hair, we did this before. Remember, Jim? Remember when
I,
Sarbanes-Oxley happened? Remember when the CEO said, how many softwares do we have? And you had to say, well, the plural of software is software. And, you start from there. And where does that come from? Well, we have 30,000 developers, and we're in a very similar situation. And what Neil is describing is governance, it is enterprise risk management, and it is the idea of doing what we, in some sense, in security, are already pretty good at, but for machine learning. And I want everybody to understand that. We shouldn't run around saying, don't do it. We should just say, wow, we've seen something like this before, and now we need to do it like a bunch of grown-ups, right? So there was one point that was slightly different, but there's similarities with software too. And that is when you choose a vendor, when you're one of the 80% or more people that have to decide which foundation model to use, there actually are risks associated that have been had management decisions already made by the vendor on your behalf. And that's tricky. So we need to understand that, there are in my work 23 risks associated with the choice of that black box. And it would be nice if we knew simple things like which data sets were used to train that up, what did we use for our, deciding whether during evaluation this thing is doing what we want it to do. And those decisions have been made in some sense by the vendors being OpenAI and Google and Microsoft and Meta and we have to decide whether they made the right decision. So how do we do that? How do you pick an LLM vendor? How do you control that choice? Do you leave that to other executives? Jim, can you address that real quickly?
Yeah, sure. The challenge, number one challenge that we face in Gen AI is the pace of change and how it's evolving quickly. So, as I said, a year ago, I would have told you about one attack surface. Today, I would talk to you about a very different attack surface. And frankly, tomorrow that could change as well, and it will change. And so, putting control and governance in place in a changing target is really challenging. However, there are some things that are foundational, very similar to software security, Gary, in that if you look at most of the regulations evolving around Gen AI governance, really globally, they all have a basis in privacy. They all have a basis in data management and privacy. And so if you think about it in that context, it's actually, it gives you something to work with.
It sounds like PII, kind of like where's the
kind
PII?
of PII, yeah, kind of PII, yeah. And Neil mentioned this word, and we cannot overuse this word when we talk about Gen AI governance, and it's observability. And so,
nice.
as a CISO, my first primary focus is on understanding what the enterprise is doing with Gen AI and kind of putting some boundaries around the learning process to maybe contain some of the implications of that. And so, Gen AI governance starts with knowing what we're doing with Gen AI across a large enterprise with a lot of moving parts and a lot of people doing different things. And that's something
that gives us something important, I think. So I want Neil to talk about this, and I know you're chomping at the bit, Neil. If we have lots of vendors, we can still have the same governance model that, we don't have to make one and only one choice about which foundation model to use. We can have the same governance model and know about the privacy concerns that Jim is talking about that are driving this. Tell us how, Neil.
I think before we go into the how, I think the inverted question is really key here, Gary. I don't think it's actually going to be possible for you to have only one foundation model provider. And the reason why is really, really simple. Let's start with the technical side of the house. We're quickly getting into a multimodal world. That means that in addition to just pure text, you're also seeing structured data like Excel documents, you see, or kind of vector DBs or just databases in general. You're seeing video, you're seeing audio, you're seeing voice as well. And you're seeing increasing differences between what is the optimal model for what kind of task. Meaning, if you are doing QA in a factory assembly line and you are trying to leverage one of these foundation models to be able to do that, and you are gauging customer sentiment, the ideal model for both tasks is likely going to be very, very different. And that's before we even start talking about the internal models you're using for information retrieval or anything like that. And then let's go to the kind of policy side of the house. What we're increasingly seeing is sovereign machine learning, where countries are prioritizing foundation models that were built or fine-tuned inside of their borders. You saw that in Canada with their announcement 2 weeks ago around preferencing effectively Cohere. You see that in Europe, where if you look at the EU AI Act and you look at some of the instantiations of it, it's likely that we're going to be preferencing Mistral or any of the other European champions. You see that in Japan with their AI legislation, as well as companies like Sakara AI. You see that in India as well. in terms of kind of the underlying data governance side of the house. So you have both, and on the technical side of the house, you also see that in the use of small language models in addition to large language models as well. So for a whole wide range of reasons, you're going to need to take an approach on the model governance side of the house where you have consistent policies across everything you're doing. You have consistent both technical and policy controls, and you have inconsistent models.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that we're getting a little tiny bit ahead of ourselves, though, because some people might not understand what a particular risk is. So we kind of covered that really fast, and I want to just tell some stories about risk so that people can feel that that would like maybe impact their organization. Let's talk about the hilarious Air Canada case. So Air Canada used a large language model on their website to answer questions about their policy for their customers. And somebody got onto the Air Canada website and said, oh, my mother has died and I need to fly, and I want to know how I get reimbursed for that flight since you guys kindly allow me to do that as a long-term Air Canada customer. And I want to take advantage of that. When should I ask for my reimbursement for this kind of, what do they call that kind of flight when?
Bereavement.
Yeah, for a bereavement fare. And the chat bot at Air Canada said, oh, don't worry about it. We're so sorry about your mother. Please just do that flight. And when you come back, you can ask for reimbursement and we'll give it to you. So the guy did that. And then he came back and he asked for reimbursement. And Air Canada said, you have to fill that out before you fly. You can't do that after the fact. And the guy said, but I was just on your website and I was talking to this thing and it said the opposite. And Air Canada said, well, too bad. You should have really read the policy. You can't just interact with that thing on the website. By the way, that thing is not really built by us. It's not our thing. Well, a judge who looked at the case said, what? You put a chatbot on your website called the Air Canada chatbot and and you're disavowing the advice that it gave? I don't think so. So Air Canada had to pony up for this thing. Now, that shows you what happens when one of these models is just wrong, which occasionally they are, and nobody put any kind of guardrails around this thing. That is one example of enterprise risk that could be caused by, in this case, a very simple chatbot. So, who has another good story? So, what do you think, Neil? Are there some other stories that can help motivate why we're working on this?
Yeah, one other example that was in the news quite a bit last year really had to do with what I would describe as rogue employees. There was a fairly substantial semiconductor company, and they hired this new employee, and the employee wasn't necessarily up to par, and he really wanted to show his coworkers how productive he was, how terrific he was. And so what did he end up doing? He took increasingly large parts of his code base. He ended up inserting them into a LLM that used his data and retrained with that data. And now you can find effectively 70% of the code for a multi-billion-dollar R&D project uh, publicly available. And this enormous R&D investment to a large degree devalued on the basis of this single employee's misaction. And when you're
Holy cow.
operating in
Yes, holy cow. I mean, so there are some bad things that can happen if you don't govern this stuff, right? Jim, do you have a story that is pithy?
There's a real strong use case in healthcare where doctors today, as practitioners, spend somewhere between 20-30% of their time doing research in medical journals, looking for the evolution of disease and treatments, and coming up with different alternatives that satisfy the needs of their patients. That's a wonderful use case for generative AI to improve the productivity of the doctor, to spend less time pouring through medical journals and more time with the results and applying that from a practice perspective for patients. and that very, very common use case. Now, in that particular case, if the output from the Gen AI model were to be inaccurate, the consequences of the practitioner putting it into practice for a patient, thinking that it's the right thing to do to treat this particular ailment, are significant. And
Right.
and so the use case, it's still a use case that we need to pursue, because we can be far better. We can have better health outcomes as a result of that. But once again, we have to have some guardrails, is a great way of describing it, to contain that risk, to make sure that it's not causing societal harm, as you mentioned
Okay,
earlier.
so our so far our reasoning is going like this. We're excited about the tech. It's got some real risks. The risks do have impacts that can be existential in some case, but certainly important for a line of business in the enterprise. How do we make these risk decisions transparent? What do we do to say, well, who holds the bag? How do you make an informed decision as an LLM adopter? And how do we get consistency? I think the answer about consistency is the governance we were talking about before, but transparency is what I want to focus on a little bit now. Neil, what do we do about that?
I think that's a really good question. I think that's where we really get into this question of how do we have the ability to audit the trail of all of our prompts, all of our responses? How do we have that visibility as a security leader in terms of what's happening across the board inside of our organization? And how do we know what decisions have been informed by what model? And are we potentially generating outputs that are the result of false information or hallucinations, or are they actually true? The reality of
That hallucination is just wrong.
well, the problem with hallucinations is, what is a hallucination?
Just
There's so
wrong.
many.
Just being wrong.
Yes, but I'll give you an example. If you have a model that was trained on data from 2019, and you ask it, who is the president of the United States? And it comes
Yeah,
back with Donald Trump. From a time dimensionality perspective, that's actually a true answer.
right, right.
Obviously, from a factual perspective, here and now in 2024, that's an incorrect statement.
Yes. So here's one of my issues with this technology, which I gotta admit again, I think it's the coolest thing I've worked with in 25 or 30 years since I had my Apple II Plus with 48K in 1981. And the cool part is that it does amazing things and it's really surprising. And the worst part is sometimes it's wrong. But we don't get to anthropomorphize it and say, oh, it's just a cute little thing that hallucinates. We should just say it's wrong. So part of understanding and being transparent about this is knowing when things are wrong and knowing things about, oh, the date, vector really matters more than we thought in some situations. So what I want to figure out is how can we set up the right system so a CISO can say, yes, we have to use that. Use it like this, be careful like that, watch out for these things. How can we, still be nimble and quick and not stodgy and still be like the grown-up in the room? So Jim, tell us how you've done this before in the past and how we're going to do it now.
Well, I'll tell you what I'm doing now. And I fundamentally believe that the CISO should be an advocate and a supporter and essentially a facilitator across the company, because it's not just cybersecurity risks. There's financial risks, there's legal risks, there's privacy risks, et cetera, et cetera. And what the CISO needs to do is facilitate the creation of principles. And a principle might say, we'll never use Gen AI for these types of applications. We will use Gen AI for these types of applications to support our business. So it allows an enterprise to kind of focus and target the research and development and exploratory, innovative work towards a particular outcome or goal or vision or direction. And principles are a lot easier to get consensus on versus actual policies. Now, policies follow. So policies follow principles. And a policy might say that we're going to look at use cases and we're going to have an intake process where a cross-functional team will look at use cases from different dimensions and determine what resources the enterprise needs to bring to bear to realize the potential of these use cases. And so that could be a policy that says anybody can do anything in Gen AI in this company, as long as you identify a use case, submit the use case for review, and then we'll identify the right resources that are necessary to pursue that. And some of those use cases, maybe we'll say,
this reminds me of a decision about whether or not to use somebody else's computer. I mean, the cloud, when you're building an application. Does that seem like a good analogy?
It is a good analogy because you have shared responsibility and accountability in a cloud environment. And that's kind of similar to Gen AI environment. Decisions made to use models include hardware implications. If you need GPU processing, and you maybe need a host for the GPU processing to satisfy your requirements. You need software and model availability, and you need data storage, and cloud hosting can solve all of that. Go ahead.
Do you remember when we were adopting static analysis and we were like, well, where are we going to put the results? And nobody thought about that. And we were like, damn, we're going to have to build a data center for that.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
And somebody had to be the grown up and go, that's going to be a really big pile. Where are we?
Exactly.
These are the decisions that we're coming up with. So
I saw recently, Gary, that if let's say I have 100 choices for LLMs, and they're actually, tens of thousands of choices, but let's say 100 choices of LLMs, and the pricing for the LLM to actually use the model typically uses increments or attributes, in this case, tokens. So for 1 million tokens, one such LLM model would charge $1 for 1 million tokens. And you might say that that's a lot or a little, but the interesting thing is there's another vendor of an LLM that charges $120 for 1 million tokens. And then there's all sorts of models in between. So $1 to $120 multiplied by millions becomes very expensive. And so technology decisions have to be made at the enterprise level for the hosting providers and the capabilities to satisfy the use of the models. And the financial risk could be tremendous to the enterprise.
10 or 20x. So we've talked about, the analogy in CISO land of trying to change the oil in your car as you're driving down the interstate at 85. But we're adding a new thing, and that is the car is driving itself.
Oh, yeah.
So
that's a good analogy.
So here's what I think. I think that in terms of machine learning security, there's some forward-thinking enterprises that have already come up with some darn good ideas, which we can steal. And Neil is in this sort of excellent seat, like the bird seat of watching all the early adopters do the earliest things and do some things that are surprisingly cool and right. So if we sort of take our, paraphrasing Gibson, the future's already here, but it's not evenly distributed. What are some things you've learned, Neil, about identifying, controlling, and governing AI risks that we're already doing, and pretty soon everybody's going to be doing it, and by pretty soon I mean in the next 5 years or so?
Yeah, of course. When we look out at the landscape of kind of the most advanced companies, what we're seeing today is hundreds of models already in use, and soon to be thousands, if not tens of thousands of versions or variants of models, and on top of that, AI kind of agents in use. The enterprise is ultimately going to massively change on a line of business basis, whether that's IT, whether that's marketing, whether that's finance, whatever that part of the company is. And individual employees, in the same way that they know how to use SQL today or that they know how to use Excel today, will be prompt engineering models moving forward and leveraging them to make themselves more efficient and effective at their task. And so the real reality that enterprises have to prepare themselves for, and I say prepare themselves in a very positive way because this will increase productivity, is how do I deal with this world where I have thousands of agents running all across my enterprise? How do I control for that? How do I add observability? How do I add my policy controls in place for that? And how do I figure out what my SOC of the future looks like, what my security controls of the future look like for this kind of new dawn that we are quickly finding ourselves in?
Outstanding. So, when you do this sort of thing, you also have to worry about regulation. And I know you know a great story, Jim, about when Phil was thinking about government regulation coming down the line. And he said, well, the only way to get in front of what the NSA is going to tell me to do is get on their board. Remember that? Right.
Yes,
So
I do.
it turns out that as CISOs, we can get in front of these things. We can lead the regulators. We can, instead of reacting or even trying to predict what they're going to do, we can impact what they're going to do and make sure that we've already built something that works that way. Is there anything new in that line that's coming down the pike that should surprise us, or are we pretty much set up for doing that already?
No, I think there's regulators and auditors are on the same learning journey as the rest of us. And so as a CISO, I think about my internal auditors, the external auditors, and the regulators as being stakeholders. And my job is to provide education for them on what we're doing to put governance in place across our enterprise. And they're as important stakeholders as employees or as the board or CEOs and senior leaders. They're just as important, and they're learning how to do their job, which is to basically demonstrate efficacy of models that are being used in terms of the guardrails. And our job is to help them do that because they're learning just like we're learning and putting it in. And frankly, there are many ways of doing that, of sharing information at appropriate times in like educational settings that would benefit all of the stakeholders and actually get them better prepared to support and help the evolution of control. Because controls, we talked about observability. There's filtering of your prompts, there's filtering of your output, there's the intake process that I spoke about, there's the hosting services, there's SaaS governance that, from a third party governance perspective that we have to do. There's software development that's changing because of the use of
a lot of stuff
LLMs, and
we know how to do these things, right?
we do know how to do these. And frankly, it's almost a little bit reassuring in that we have solved these problems before from a governance standpoint.
Yep.
There are some adjustments that we have to make in this with Gen AI. I have no question about it. But at the end of the day, we can do this.
We can do it. All right. So we've covered a lot of important ground. We're only 1 minute and 20 seconds off our target. And since I'm the moderator, I get to go first with what the most important take home is. And I'm going to steal that last one. You can say yes to machine learning and AI and be a leader. So that's my take home message. I'm going to let you go next, Jim, and then final word to Neil. You have one sentence to do this, Jim.
Machine learning applied narrowly is something that enterprise knows how to do today successfully and how to govern. We now need to do the same for Gen AI, and we're on the path towards doing that. And we have to understand that attack surface is going to continue to evolve.
Excellent. Neil, take us out.
Ultimately, having policies in place and technical controls are really the key enablement mechanisms for you to be able to leverage generative AI across the enterprise. We're excited to be able to help you do that at Calypso AI. And thank you for listening to our webinar.
All right.
And
And
thank
we're
you
out.
so much.
Bye,
Perfect.
everybody.